All right, let's jump right into this. We're going to unpack the core message of one of the most influential spiritual figures of the last century, Billy Graham. We're going to break down the central ideas he preached to literally millions of people all over the globe.
And let's kick things off with this really powerful, kind of mind-bending statement from the man himself. I mean, think about that for a second. It perfectly sets the stage for his life's work. A belief in what comes after death that was so certain he saw his own passing not as an end, but as a brand new beginning. And that quote leads us straight to the big one, right? This is the fundamental question that Graham's entire message was trying to answer. It's a question people have been wrestling with forever in every culture throughout all of history. So, to really get Graham's answer, we have to start where he started, with his diagnosis of the human condition. For him, you couldn't even begin to talk about a solution until you were crystal clear on the problem. You know, Graham lived through some turbulent times. But he believed it that the root of all the world's problems, we're talking war, conflict, you name it, wasn't really political or economic. He argued the real issue was internal, something found deep inside every single one of us. Now, this slide gets to a key term in his message, sin. But when he used that word, he wasn't just talking about a list of bad things you do. He presented it more like a fundamental state, a disease, as he put it, that messes with every part of who we are, how we think, the choices we make, and the way we feel. And if it's a disease, what are the symptoms? Well, he would point to these things we all recognize, right? Envy, hate, greed. He saw these not as just random mistakes, but as the outward signs of that deeper internal condition. And this really drives home a crucial point for him. This was universal. In Graham's view, this condition wasn't a problem for those people over there. No, it was a shared human experience. Absolutely no one was exempt. Okay, so if that's the diagnosis, a universal problem deep in the human heart, what's the cure? For Billy Graham, the message always, powerfully pointed to one single event in history, the cross. Now, this is really interesting. He made this huge distinction between the cross we see every day, as jewelry or a symbol on a building, and what he believed the cross actually meant. For him, the real cross wasn't about decoration. It was about these massive concepts: atonement, forgiveness, and the most extreme expression of God's love. And this gets to the absolute core of it. In Graham's teaching, the crucifixion wasn't some tragic accident. It wasn't a political execution that went sideways. He taught that it was the whole point. It was the central mission, the very reason Jesus came to earth. Graham would often describe the intense, brutal physical suffering involved, the whipping, carrying that heavy cross, the nails, but he always emphasized that as horrific as that was, the physical pain was actually secondary to the ultimate spiritual suffering that was taking place. This cry from the cross, this was the moment Graham identified as the absolute climax of all that suffering. For him, this wasn't just a cry of physical pain. This was the sound of a deep, profound spiritual separation from God. And that leads to this core idea he preached: atonement. The way Graham explained it was that on the cross, Jesus was essentially taking the punishments, the guilt, for all of humanity's sin onto himself. It was this act that made it possible for people to be reconnected with God. So, where does all this lead? Well, Graham's message wasn't just some interesting theological lecture to think about. He believed it demanded a personal response. It required a choice from every single person who heard it. So he didn't just present the information and leave it at that. He laid out a very clear path for anyone who wanted to accept this solution for themselves. And it wasn't passive. It required you to do something. The first action he called for was repentance. He defined this not as just feeling guilty or saying you're sorry. No, it was a conscious decision to change your whole direction in life, to literally turn away from a life defined by that disease of sin and turn toward God. And the second action was faith. Again, for Graham, this was so much more than just intellectually agreeing that Jesus was real. For him, to believe meant to commit, to fully entrust your entire life into his hands. And, he didn't just talk the talk. This was his own story. He often told people about how, as a teenager, he very reluctantly responded to this exact same message. He made a decision that he said completely and utterly transformed him for the rest of his life. So this personal path of change, this 1-2 punch of repentance and faith,
is what leads to what Graham called the ultimate hope, the grand promise of his message. He always taught that the death on the cross, as huge as it was still an incomplete story. I mean, if it ended there, it would just be a tragedy, right? The real power of the message was locked in what happened next. These simple words, spoken by an angel at an empty tomb, were, according to Graham, the single greatest headline the world has ever heard. This was the absolute turning point of all human history. The resurrection was everything. It was the ultimate proof that everything Jesus claimed was true. It was the guarantee that death didn't get the final say. For Graham, this one event was the entire foundation for Christian hope. And that brings us to the final incredible promise. The hope of resurrection wasn't just for Jesus. It was a promise extended to every single person who followed that path of repentance and faith. It's the answer to that very first question: if a man die, shall he live again? And so we'll end with the very same direct, very personal question that Billy Graham himself so often used. After explaining the diagnosis, the solution, the path, and the promise, he would always turn the focus back to the individual, leaving them with this one thought to consider for themselves.